A very warm welcome to this Conservative Home event, dreaming of and delivering net zero in partnership with Atos. I'm Charlotte Gill, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and today I'll be chairing a panel discussion on the UK's efforts towards avoiding catastrophic climate change. We'll be looking at the progress that has been made through the Paris Agreement, we'll be discussing the transition towards a net zero economy, and we'll be considering what role technology can play in accelerating progress towards achieving net zero in the UK and globally. And with me to discuss these topics, I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Griffith, the UK's net zero business champion and MP for Arundel and South Downs, Benedict McAleenan, Senior Advisor on Energy and Environment at Policy Exchange, Emma Gatten, the Environment Editor at the Daily Telegraph, and Kulveer Ranger, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Communications for the United Kingdom and Ireland at Atos. So first of all, hello everyone and welcome today. To kick off with, I'm going to ask each panellist to give their opening thoughts on the general topic, whatever you would like to offer up to the floor, and then we'll talk about how we can work towards net zero, and we'll have some questions. And let me also use this moment to say that if you're watching, please feel free to use our Q&A system and ask any questions you'd like along the way. So let's kick off with Andrew, please.
Hey Charlotte, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Let me kick off with a little bit of a scene setter, because this is a Conservative audience and Conservatives can be really proud that this is not only the greenest government ever, but also something you don't often hear, but that Britain is a genuine world leader on climate action. While some talk about the climate emergency, this government's getting on and tackling it. We were the first to bake into law a 2050 net zero target, and our target, our NDC, of 68% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 is one of the most ambitious of any country on the planet. The UK's got the fastest growth in renewable energy of any G20 nation, and the fastest per capita reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, it's more than twice the rate of the next major economy. As of this morning, more than 56% of all the electricity being used in the UK was generated from renewable sources, and this government plans to phase out coal for electricity completely within the life of this current parliament. That is way faster than many of our European neighbours. In fact, by contrast, a German child born today will be leaving school before her country stops burning coal in the year 2038. And it's not just energy, we're a green automotive world leader. The last new combustion engine car in the UK will be sold in 2030, whilst across the channel, the French will be rolling out carbon emitting vehicles for another 10 years to 2040. Some G20 countries don't even have an end date target. To decarbonise road transport, we're giving every citizen £2,500 towards the cost of an electric vehicle, plus free road tax, and we're funding 3/4 of the cost of a home charging point. And there are now more charging point locations than petrol stations, with 23,000 public charging points in over 15,000 locations. We've added another 1,200 in the last 30 days. That's an average of 40 a day. There'll probably be one or two on that basis just while we have this session in the next hour or so. And for those Conservative colleagues in local government, that 75% government grant is available for councils too. So do make sure that your office is applying for it. The reason we can make so much progress so quickly is that we Conservatives believe in the ferocious problem-solving power of free enterprise and free markets, that human ingenuity and innovation is the answer, not delaying ambulances with street protests or blockading a free press. Within the right frameworks, business is the solution, not the problem, and that just as global capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty and transformed the length of human life, and just as we've seen with the vaccine development, then so too it'll be business that actually solves the climate crisis. Just this morning, Liz Truss has announced the UK will roll out the green carpet for some of the world's most powerful executives and heads of major institutions at a global investment summit later this year. That sort of initiative is exactly what we should be doing. And post-Brexit, global Britain is brilliantly placed to capitalise on the demand for green investment, whether it's new gigafactories, hydrogen, wind power, carbon capture and storage, jet zero, or nature recovery programs. Finally, let me just add that technology and firms like Atos have a huge role to play. At heart, this is a challenge of using the world's finite resources in the best possible way. So whether that's smarter cities, data-driven government, or even quantum-powered computer algorithms, digital technology is a huge enabler. So as we look forward to the world's leaders descending on the UK for the UN Global Climate Summit this November, an event which John Kerry has rightly called the world's last best chance to tackle the climate crisis, be reassured that at this incredibly important moment for the planet, I think we've got excellent leadership from our Prime Minister and from this government.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And next I'll go to Benedict, please.
Thanks, Charlotte. And thank you also to ConHome and to Atos for hosting such an important discussion. Fundamentally, we do need to speed up progress on net zero, because if you put all of the national emission reduction targets that were set out under the Paris Agreement, they still don't add up to anything even close to avoiding a climate disaster. There's huge overshoot in those targets. So we all need to raise our ambitions and find a way to sort this out. I'm still very confident and optimistic that we can rise to the challenge, but I think we need to be aware, especially here in the UK, that our progress to date was basically the easy stuff. It's actually quite easy to speak to a few CEOs at big energy companies to shut down dirty power stations. It's relatively easy to put the first 20 gigawatts of wind turbines in the North Sea. That's why we've done so well so quickly in the UK. But what's much harder is what we need to do next, which is introducing far more renewables, decarbonising transport and people's homes and so on. That's much more political and much more complicated. There is, though, a big opportunity here. The UK is great at designing new things, and we have a thriving data science and software sector, and we produce great engineers, and we have a fantastic finance and services sector that others are desperate to replicate. Indeed, advanced economies have undergone a big transition in the last 2 or 3 decades, where we've shifted investment into these intangible economic assets, such as software and systems design. The economists Jonathan Haskell and John Westlake have a great book on the topic, Capitalism Without Capital. They call these assets intangible because they exist on the whole digitally. We're leaders in these sorts of assets, and we can deploy them to achieve net zero. I think the 2 big ways that digitization can help with net zero are, number 1, democratizing the solutions, and number 2, monitoring the risks. When I say democratizing solutions, I really mean creating new tools that help us to move away from unsustainable practices and towards sustainable ones, and putting those into the hands of small businesses and individuals, as well as big business and government. So 2 examples from energy and finance. In energy, Octopus Energy and OVO Energy and innovators like that are creating smart systems that manage thousands of homes' energy supplies at once, and working out the cheapest times to balance supply and demand for energy down to the millisecond. And the bill payer isn't sitting there managing this stuff, the system does it for them, which is very different to the 20th century system, which depended on people in control rooms telephoning each other to turn power stations on and off. The end result is cheaper energy, but also systems that work better with highly distributed and intermittent energy sources like wind and solar. Secondly, in finance, banks and auditors and insurers and so on are creating new tools for helping customers to understand better energy options and other sustainable solutions. It's known as transition finance, and it has a massive role in moving the world forward. Those systems are mostly digital, and we can export them globally. So this is about larger organizations and smaller innovators putting digital tools into the hands of smaller companies and individuals. That also moves me on to my second point about monitoring the risks. We need to know better what's going on in the world so that we can shift capital to less exposed and less damaging practices. There's a project called GeoAsset, which is being promoted by the Spatial Finance Initiative. And it aims to use satellites and artificial intelligence to build a map of every physical asset in the world so that we can understand the economic impacts of climate change and move our economy globally onto a more sustainable footing. It's as big a challenge as mapping the human genome. We can also use these tools and others to track emissions and our progress in meeting targets in a much more intelligent way. And importantly, we can share those data. So there's a huge economic opportunity and a moral imperative to use the best digital tools available. But as I said, there are also some big challenges here. 3 challenges or risks are the heavy-handed state, the vulnerability of digital assets, and the need to cooperate on data standards. The heavy-handed state is a natural risk that comes with the need to overhaul our economic model. The state is necessarily taking a bigger role, but that must not mean that market incentives and society's inventiveness are crowded out. Instead, we need to use market mechanisms and purposeful deregulation to find solutions to climate change and ecological decline. The energy efficient smart systems that I mentioned earlier really do depend on a change in the market's design to allow more innovation. Secondly, the vulnerability of digital assets. Net zero is going to mean much, much more use of electricity for transport, heating, hydrogen, etc. If we increasingly use digital systems, then more of our economy is exposed to cybersecurity challenges, among other challenges, and that means we need to guard ourselves much more actively. And finally, we need to cooperate. I've said that we can democratize and share data to move more of the world ahead in this transition. But that means we need to think about data standards across borders. The internet is fragmenting and China is seeking to create its own web standards, which is a problem for net zero as well as a broader geopolitical challenge. So those are 3 challenges in all of this. I think fundamentally digital technologies have a massive role to play in achieving net zero, but there are also challenges and risks that we have to address. I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Cool, thank you, Benedict. And Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. It's great to be here, and thanks to our hosts as well. I think, in many ways, net zero is a tech revolution, and I think we know at this point what we need to do and where we need to reduce our emissions to get to net zero. And there isn't a single sector that's not going to be reliant on some new technology to get there. So that's whether that's using robots in farming or perfecting our battery technology or using better data that can support a vigilant carbon trading market. And I think tech spans the big questions, the major questions, like how do we decarbonize our manufacturing, to really the very basic stuff that's in our homes. So that's kind of broadband that can help cut our travel emissions, for instance. I think for the UK, one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest questions to some extent is follow through. We have a great research sector, but one part of the puzzle we might be missing there is turning that into a reality and how we turn that into a marketable project. I can take one example that we wrote about earlier this year about a pioneering project in Oxford where they're creating solar panels that are potentially twice as efficient as they are currently. But when it came to manufacture, they simply found it much easier to set up in Germany, which is where they're now planning to manufacture that. And you have to ask, what's the knock-on impact of that? And I think similarly, when we look at one of our biggest challenges in decarbonising our homes, a big part of the tech there is heat pumps, and we know how that works and we know how to do it. But there is a big question about whether, for instance, we have the engineering knowledge to deploy it. Are our engineers ready? Do they understand how the home system works? Are they ready to go out and do that? And again, that just has an impact on, I think, the speed of how we can get to this transition, which I think, as Benedict was saying, we need to do much more quickly than we are doing. And one of our big challenges, I think, for the UK is how we get these things right so we can claim a position, as we do, as a global leader in climate change. But I think, tech is a great opportunity, and it's a great way, I think, to connect with people over net zero. I think if you talk to people, if you ask people if they want to change their lifestyle simply to help cut carbon emissions, you might be greeted with sort of quite a lukewarm response. But if you put to them the opportunity of a new technology, whether that's EVs, whether that's controlling the heating in their home, it's suddenly a kind of more exciting prospect, I think, and it's really a good way of engaging with people. But then I will say, just to end, I think that there is a bit of a risk. I think the past year has made it clear that there is a real imbalance, both kind of within countries and between countries, about access to technology. And that's a question of can be infrastructure, resources, or it really can be a question of just how digital savvy some people are and whether we're reaching those people. And I think the message across the net zero transition is how to make sure that you're taking people along with you, and that the people and places aren't being left behind.
Thank you, Emma. And over to you, Kulveer.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and delighted to be part of the panel, delighted to sponsor. So a word from our sponsor. So Atos, some of you might be asking the question, why Atos? Atos is a global technology provider. We operate in vast markets across the world with 110,000 people and support every sector. And we see a view that's demonstrating the change that's happening, whether it's in manufacturing, health and life sciences, financial services and insurance. We, for example, support in one way or another 15 of the top 20 banks in the world, 11 of the top 15 insurance companies in the world. We help Atos, the clothing online retailer. We support hospitals in transforming digitally. And in every element, we see the need and the usage, the exponential usage of technology and digital services. So we're at the heart of how people are changing and transformation is happening. And obviously, we all know that the COVID pandemic has turbocharged a lot of this change as well. We've seen that as well. But at the heart of this is a question of sustainability. And it's something that's been close to my heart as well over the last, 15, 20 years in my career. I've been very fortunate to work in the public sector, the private sector, and for a period of time, Boris Johnson, when he was Mayor of London as well, where I was his environmental advisor as well as transport and digital. But actually, that's where it all came together, because the question that the then mayor asked me was, can you look at the environmental brief and see what we're doing for London? And my response to Boris Johnson was, Boris, it's about the environment, but actually it's about technology. Because whether it be about Octopus Energy, as Benedict was mentioning, or some of the great initiatives that it's good to see Andrew and the government are still pushing forward on electric vehicles, or how we use different types of energy, decentralized energy, for example, in cities and towns. These all need to be managed and measured, and the improvements come through the more and greater use and efficient use of digital technology. So as one of the companies that provides that infrastructure, that capability, we feel we have an actual responsibility. I think Benedict mentioned a moral responsibility to be looking at how we are delivering it and the impact on the environment of the services that we can provide. And that's why at the heart of what we do, and something that our group CEO, Elie Girard, has said very clearly and has made our mantra, is to deliver secure, decarbonised digital services. So that's the vision. And actually, we've entitled this, the title of this session is, not to just dream, but to deliver. It's because we're also saying we shouldn't just dream. We now must deliver these things. And again, harping back to what Benedict was saying, faster. We know that the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement targeted 2050, and it's great that global governments signed up to it and are aiming for 2050, but it's far too slow. It's far too late. We must go faster. And we as a business have revised our target to be net zero to 2035, but that wasn't enough, because we realized last year we were able to cut by a further 15% our carbon footprint. Therefore, we're targeting to be net zero by 2028. Now, yes, we're in control of a lot of that. But by the way, those targets are looking at our supply chains, working with our partners, working with our customers. we have to work in, again, Benedict, you did mention this, in cooperation and collaboration in industry, but across governments as well, because it will be about standards and it will be about how we manage our route to net zero to ensure that we deliver it. We're passionate about this. I'm passionate about it. I think that it isn't just an opportunity anymore, Charlotte. It's definitely a reality. I was mentioning to you earlier about electric vehicles way back when Boris and I were talking about them in 2008. They were still using laptop batteries and struggling to make it around, the whole of the M25 without stopping. In fact, I remember being on a bus that actually did stop that was electric. But now those aren't the problems. Now it's about that we have the tools. We now need to manage and accelerate our way to delivery for everyone and make sure we take everybody with us on this journey as we deliver net zero. And that's a role we at Atos would like to play as well. I think you're on mute, Charlotte.
Apologies. I was just saying they're all fantastic comments to listen to, all coming from lots of different angles. One thing I'd like to pick up on is Kulveer. You're talking about the need, that we most people accept that we need to move fast on this, that time is of the essence. But one thing that I think maybe a lot of consumers are thinking, or members of the public, is, gosh, this, it's going to cost quite a lot, doing this climate change, and Boris Johnson's green industrial revolution involves huge investments. How can we, so I guess I wanted to explore, how can we reassure consumers that this is going to translate into affordable policies for them? So maybe Andrew, you'd like to take us through the government's plans.
Yeah, I think it's very important to bear in mind a couple of things. One is that if we all move together, the cost of achieving that change is transformationally lower. So, for example, you've seen what's happened on renewable energy. That does date back some time, although the government's got a plan to quadruple that over the next 20 or 30 years. As a result, all of us will be able to access low-cost, renewable, 100% net zero energy. And that means if you're applying that to an industrial process, if you're a consumer, the first next best action that you can take is to switch your energy at the flick of a switch using innovative new energy providers that are disrupting the market. You can access that clean green energy. That's nothing to do with consumers having to make difficult choices. There are some of those. Similarly, if you pick to really at the other end of this spectrum, a hard to abate sector like aviation. Now that's going to take longer because the lead time on some of the airframes that are flying today, will take a very long time. But if the government can send demand signals for things like sustainable aviation fuel, which is exactly the same chemistry as the fuel that goes into the aircraft today, it's just got a different source. Maybe a biofuel or a fuel that's been decarbonised, then you can bridge that transition. In some cases, we will have to pay a little bit more because of the externalities that we've been inflicting on our environment. But in general, my experience is that consumers are a little bit ahead of business, and business are already a little bit ahead of government. Now, I don't entirely exempt the UK, but I do think the UK government is an exemplar on this and is setting a real position of leadership. That means that some of our industries can come out into this brave new industrial world quicker, just as we did with the original industrial revolution. And that means ultimately we're going to create jobs and prosperity, because I think a number of speakers, Emma and Benedict, both talked about bringing people with us on the journey. That's of course important. If you're going to sustain any transition at this sort of scale, it's really important that you communicate what we're trying to do. I think the Prime Minister's 10-point plan is as good and as simple example of government communication as you'll find in the last 10 years. But then you also sustain that so that it's not just the pain, it's also the gain as well. And I think, it'll be an important thing to continue to get right. Right now, I do think we've got it about right.
Okay, and Benedict, do you want to follow on from that?
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, I think it's a very important and valid question, because ultimately, if you're shifting your economy, it is going to cost money in a lot of different ways, and we need to be extremely aware about that. I think A couple of things that are often overlooked. One is that the benefits of net zero transition are going to be huge, and we actually don't know the true costs over the full range of this transition, but we also don't know the huge benefits. So, you know, for example, the cuts in, the improvements in air quality in the centres of our cities can lead to all sorts of economic benefits, especially within the health sector and productivity and those sorts of things. And so there are knock-on effects that are beneficial for our economy, which counteract those costs. There are also cheaper ways of doing things that we're not aware of yet. I think if people said that it was going to cost, you know, £40 strike price for offshore wind, you know, 20 years ago, they would have laughed at you. But that's exactly what we're looking at now. That beats all the sort of cost projections for those new technologies that were put out at the start of this great effort. So the costs are potentially lower than some are estimating. I think the CCC put the cost as at around 1% of GDP. The costs are lower than many assume, and also the benefits are higher. But there's still an imperative to keep pushing down those costs, and the best way that you can do that is by using new technologies and opening up markets for that. I spoke about deregulation before. That's extremely important for allowing markets to really allocate resources efficiently. I think, though, there are going to be market failures, though. We have to be aware that, for example, there are going to be gaps in EV charging networks that we need to address. And, you know, for example, Policy Exchange released a paper about this recently, and we identified the need to deploy charge points 5 times faster than we're currently doing, especially in rural areas where that's not being supplied by the market. So government does need to keep on that, so that nobody is left behind in achieving all of the benefits of this transition.
Cool. Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy anyone who has to kind of work through the politics of this. And I do think that there is a kind of importance of being upfront really about some of the costs and where they are going to fall, because otherwise, you know, people aren't going to not notice when it happens, I think. But I think, as Benedict says, I think there's a really important thing about emphasizing some of the benefits. And I think air quality is kind of one of those, and also emphasizing some of the long-term costs. So if you look at EVs, yes, it's a big upfront cost, but actually in the long term, it can work out cheaper. And the benefits of having kind of clean air are just kind of, I think everyone feels that in an everyday sense. One thing I will say is that I think what's important to get right is some of the consumer protections around a lot of this, around kind of, you know, home heating. Some of this is like quite new and changing quite quickly. And you talk about the charging infrastructure as well. We know there's a big difference, for instance, in what some of the off-street charging, the privately owned chargers charge, and what you will pay if you are charging this at your house. So if you don't have, you know, off-street parking, then you know you're going to be left behind in that sense. So I think there's a lot of consumer protection issues that we need to kind of look at to kind of help people make this transition.
Cool. And Kulveer?
Well, I agree with what everyone said, but particularly what Andrew was saying about consumers doing this together. And what we mean there is probably consumer pressure and even a bit of consumer activism, you know, because they can drive change in industry, and we've seen that happen. But we do need more education of the consumer base on things that they don't see. And that's where I think we come in, the big technology infrastructure providers, because we can see what they can't see, which is where the infrastructure might not be efficient, where energy efficiency around data and data management and how applications are structured, how the systems are designed, huge swathes of usage of power that makes things inefficient, that is not probably visible to the end consumer because they're not seeing that part of the service that they actually use, touch and feel. And I think that is really crucial because there's a lot of unknown. It's sort of, you know, we see the tip of the iceberg, but we don't see underneath it. And again, I'd say we're absolutely proud about what we've been doing in this area, because we've been actually for the last 2 years globally recognized by the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as the #1 IT services provider for providing sustainable solutions and services. Now, that would not be known probably beyond our own business, let alone in the industry. And I think when consumers start to recognize things like that, they can then demand and see that the services that they want to use, that they think are green and sustainable, generally are through the whole supply chain. I think this is really important because it's the same thing when it comes to electric vehicles. You know, how sustainable is your vehicle? I know you're using electricity rather than petrol or diesel, but there's a lot of energy now being used. How is that being minimized in terms of its delivery to it? I know from being an EV user, the amount of different systems it's now using, the updates it's receiving through the air and everything else that it needs could equate to quite a footprint in its own right. So we need to look at all of the systems, the whole ecosystem around what services a consumer use, give them the information around the whole picture so they make or can be the right kind of consumer pressure to get the right kind of results for them.
Could I just add a further point, I think, because there's so much discussion about consumers here. I think there's often an assumption that we need to persuade consumers to do the right thing. But actually, you know, we were talking about Kulveer's car before, and, you know, we weren't talking about the energy efficiency of it. We were talking about it has some cool doors. And, you know, those are really practical for you know, putting kids in and out. And Emma was making this point earlier that, you know, Elon Musk didn't go and say, I'm going to make a really, you know, morally good car. He said, I'm going to make the greatest car that people really want to drive. And people do want to drive Teslas. It's a valuable car, you know, it's what I think the most valuable car company in the world, not because it's green, but because it's cool and it's got good cars and people want to drive it. And that's the way you're gonna convince people that this is going to be easier and more efficient and cheaper and easy to use and all of those sorts of things. And it will look good too.
Yeah, and on that point, I guess electric cars, like, people are quite interested, but one of the concerns that always comes up is about charging, and, you know, if they get this vehicle, is the infrastructure there? Andrew, I wondered from your perspective what the plans for that were.
Yeah, the infrastructure, first of all, is there now. So that's a slightly backward-looking meme. People understand that because people have been, you know, it's growing fast. So by definition, people will say, "Oh, well, I'm not aware of a charger in my street." Actually, if you go and look, you can find brilliant digital technology apps that will show you not just where all of those chargers are, but their current status and their compatibility. Secondly, there is a lot of government support going into that. The constraining factors are actually not really, I think, the amount of financial support. It's often things like planning and just finding safe places to put them. But as I mentioned, the government will fund 75% of the cost of a charger, both for you, but also if you're a councillor, your council. So there should be a relative abundance, and they're increasing by the hundreds every single week. There's clearly more to do. And technology is solving that. But you've also seen recently really big enterprises like Shell and BP have both really put their shoulder to the wheel, metaphorically, on charging infrastructure. And that's sort of what it needed. I mean, Kulveer mentioned Source London. I mean, I used to have an electric vehicle. It wasn't quite ready for prime time, to be quite honest. I mean, the reason why these large global successful companies are large, global and successful is they do stuff really, really well. And so we're now getting that degree of mobilization of capital, government support and prioritization, and this momentum, what I call the snowball rolling downhill, around electric vehicles. So it helps that the government's expressed an ambition, you know, in terms of regulation for switch off, that creates a demand curve that can mobilize people against that. So I actually think I would lay down the gauntlet and say, actually, there are a lot more chargers than people think. You know, range anxiety will be solved in time through more chargers and better batteries. And now what we need to do is start doing the same initiatives for hydrogen. Because if you look at commercial vehicles, hydrogen is going to be part of the solution for that. And there's definitely a dearth of infrastructure for hydrogen, and the government needs to bring forward some plans on that one.
Great. And one thing that will also come out of the pandemic is some people aren't using vehicles at all. Something like 11%, there was an 11% drop in greenhouse gases in 2020 in the UK. What do we think about how are we going to will we use elements of the pandemic to bring down carbon emissions? Is there anything we can take moving forward? Maybe making working from home easier? What are your thoughts, Kulveer?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charlotte, because we've heard a lot about, people's habits changing due to pandemic, lockdown. We've all done the working from home thing. So what does that really mean? And I think this is where we've got to talk about the data. And we've really got to talk about visualization, information, making it accessible to people to really be able to understand not just what's going on, but their impact. And I think it's something what Andrew was saying as well, that you can find charging points if you look at the right app and what's going on around them. But where's the integrated view that says, what are you doing when you buy an electric vehicle, the impact that you're having, the less energy that you're doing, the incentivization, and a very clever man called Mike Bloomberg is often quoted as saying, if you can measure it, you can manage it, but it also enables people to really engage with it. And I think we have to do much, much more about demonstrating what's going on. Now, for example, actually, one of the things that we're doing is we're looking to develop an app leading up to COP26 called Terra 2. And this is based on, we work with the European Space Agency and have a huge amount of data around air quality and impact of different behavior and interventions and what they're doing on different geographical locations, be that cities, countries, etc., etc. We need to make that visible, but we need to make it visible for the citizen. We need them to have accessibility to see what's really improving around them. Because Benedict said, people want electric cars, yes, because they are electric. There's a bit about, being sustainable, but they've got to look good. Musk, yes, wanted to develop an electric car because he had a Prius, but he wanted to replace his 911, so he built the Roadster. So we've got to have something that's really good and easy to see, but citizens want to see the impact to encourage them. So I think we've got to make the data available. We've got to make it visible. We've got to put the power in the hands of people so they can see their interventions that they're buying into are having an impact. And I think that is part of the transaction that people have with politicians for the policies they make and for companies for the promises they're making about delivering sustainability.
And Emma, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, just on the question of like the impact of the pandemic, I think that we can sort of overstate that or kind of jump to some conclusions about that may not be correct. If we look at, for instance, the impact of working from home and having offices open, which seems to be the way we're going as more of a hybrid model, the impact is that you have more emissions because you are lighting and heating both places, for instance. We had people move away massively from public transport because they're, understandably quite concerned and moving more towards using their cars. So I think that in some ways, when we talk about the kind of lifestyle impact of the pandemic, I think we can overstate it, and I think it can be a bit of a distraction because ultimately, as I said, when it comes to getting to net zero, we know what we need to do. Our lives aren't going to change, probably not that much, so we need to just focus on getting it down in the areas that we know we need to get it down in. I think one area where they actually might have had more of an impact, and I think time will tell, is on travel, is on air travel for business specifically, which is only a smaller portion of air travel, but it could have a significant impact on that because actually we've realised that we don't need to get in a plane and travel half the world to have a business meeting. So I think that, but then, as I said, that relies on things like everyone having great broadband, everyone having access to this technology, and everyone being, on the same level of technology. But I think we will sort of have to wait and see. And the thing is to not overly focus on relying on that as a way to get to net zero. I mean, I did notice the other day Singapore have opened a hotel that's designed solely for going to the hotel, never leaving the hotel, and having a business meeting during a pandemic. So perhaps the appetite hasn't completely dropped off.
Oh, wow. Benedict, did you have some thoughts on that?
To be honest, I strongly agree with what Emma just said. You know, we fundamentally, we don't know what the outcome of all of this will be. But if you imagine, you know, 30 million households making their coffee in the morning and making their lunch, you know, in a way that they used to be, all of this used to be centralized. And, you know, I bet there's an awful lot more efficiency in the prep kitchen than there is in all of these many households. So I think we don't really know yet, but I think it's true to say, yes, people will think twice about business meetings on another continent now, which you know, again, we'll wait and see what that looks like in reality. But fundamentally, what the pandemic is creating is a sort of willingness for flexibility. It has sort of shaken up the economic model in a way that means that we can potentially get the best bits of it and apply those. And get rid of the worst things. Certainly, you know, I'm desperate to get back into the office and interact and exchange ideas and chat with people. But there will be things that we want to keep about all of this. So who knows? I don't really have a straight answer for you.
So I think, so moving on to a more international landscape, I think it was Andrew who brought up John Kerry saying that COP26 was the world's last best chance to really tackle climate change. You know, the UK making these commitments is one thing, but how is Boris Johnson going to get everyone else on board with his very ambitious plan? What do you say to that, Andrew?
Well, the biggest contribution that we can make in the UK is our position of global leadership, right? The maths is we're somewhere between 1.8 and 2% of global emissions. So we can lead by example, which we are, it's no coincidence that in almost every area, the UK is setting the bar, whether it's switching off electric combustion engine, decarbonising the energy grid, bringing forward industrial solutions. It's because we are able to lead by example. Secondly, to use our formidable soft power position. You know, it's something we take in the UK for granted, sitting on the G7, on the G20, having the presidency of the Commonwealth, now having the presidency of the G7, immediately afterwards going into the Commonwealth heads of government meetings. So the UK, you know, we shouldn't take that for granted. And there are formidable diplomats and people in government who are working tirelessly 24/7, conducting the diplomacy behind the scenes that you need to underwrite a successful COP. The geopolitics of that look pretty favourable, with Biden having marched the US straight back into the heart of the Paris Accords. So, you know, you can't take anything for granted, but there's an awful lot of work, and I think that will be successful. And the UK's position of leadership is part of that. We're also, you know, a huge, great research and finance power in the world. And so many of the answers to decarbonising sub-Saharan Africa, you know, will be being created in the United Kingdom, in our institutes, in our universities, in some of the overseas development institutes that we do. And London, the City of London, is the world centre for green and sustainable finance. And again, we'll bring forward the sort of products that will help finance this transition, including potentially nature-based solutions and carbon markets. So that financial architecture, that financial capability to replumb the world. You know, this is what we're doing. We're completely replumbing the world away from one particular form of chemistry to another. And that's going to be lubricated by global capital. That plumbing is happening right here, right now in London. So, you know, I don't want to overstate our centrality to the world. I mean, this is a proper shared global initiative, and multilateral institutions are at the heart of it. But I'm equally very clear-sighted about the UK's incredibly important role within it. And so both by creating new markets, by creating regulatory frameworks, and by leading by example, we are underwriting the success of the UN Climate Summit this year.
Great. And Kulveer, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, Andrew's covered a lot there and covered exactly some of the things that why we should be optimistic about COP26. And if I was advising the Prime Minister now, I'd be saying what Andrew said, and I'm sure he is, but also, and probably not holding Boris back, at saying, go faster. There's an opportunity for COP26 to revise the target date that was set in the Paris Agreement. We can see it across the board that most people, businesses, governments are bringing down their own targets in various areas, from whether it be about the combustion engine or whether it be about energy usage in homes or when we're going to stop using gas, various other things. So we can all see that there's been an opportunity. Now, coupled with that, what the pandemic has done in terms of turbocharging our acceptance of change in behavior and public will and political will, why not take this opportunity to express that definitively and it's going to take a lot of diplomacy, and that's what Andrew's talking about in terms of all the efforts that will go in. But there does seem to be an opportunity here to say it's not about 2050, it's actually about being faster and doing it sooner and making that commitment to it. So I think that's the real opportunity that sits here for November.
And Emma?
Well, I'd be quite interested actually from Andrew, what actually he thinks the outcome of COP we're trying to achieve is. I mean, in a very specific sense, what is it that we want to, what would be a good COP26? What are we trying to achieve? Because I think at the moment, that's very unclear. And it may be that, we're having this kind of diplomacy to try and get us somewhere. But I think without setting that out, it's going to be very difficult to know whether we've had a good COP or not.
Andrew, did you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I think the COP president, Alex Sharma, set out last week in a speech the answers to that question. It's multifaceted, so I'm not going to try and do it here because you get into a lot of subtleties. I mean, it's not as singular as saying. I mean, I like where Kulveer's coming from. It's not 2050 or 2045. There are multiple elements to abatement, to resilience. It would be fantastic if you got the world to where the UK is in terms of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and an equivalent level of ambition. I mean, that would seem to me a pretty good outcome and a big distance from where we are today. To be clear, I mean, this is hard yards. You'll be inside that world, Emma, and understand that. Not everybody on today's call will, but there's a big gap between the action of where the UK is today and even where post-Biden the US is currently committed to. We're not going to do this self-evidently without the US and China. They are both engaged. They are both on the pitch for the first time since Paris, but we've got to land that.
Benedict, what do you think about COP26 and how we can get everyone on board with the message?
Well, I would encourage everybody to read my article on ConservativeHome.com about this very topic, where ultimately I think we're not one of the biggest players, but we are the host, and therefore Andrew is absolutely spot on that fundamentally this is about diplomacy and soft power and bringing everybody to the table and asking them to raise their ambitions. But it's also about quite technical points about about how do you finance this? How do you get the right balance between advanced nations and poorer nations? And how do you restructure debt, for example, after COVID-19, so that we free up an awful lot more capital for people to invest in sustainable infrastructure around the world? There are massive questions around that, and ultimately those are going to be decided by the biggest players around the table, people like China and the US and the EU. And the UK's role in that is facilitating it. So a lot of it will be, done by the Sherpas between now and the actual conference. I think. We published a paper recently on one of the biggest elements of this, which is green finance. And we would love to see the UK using its central diplomatic role over 2021. As Andrew said, we're going to be hosting the G7. Italy, which is hosting COP26 in partnership with us, will also be hosting the G20. Then we've got the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We've got all of these different ways in which the UK can actually advance green finance reforms. And that's a huge opportunity for the City of London. It's a huge opportunity for us to sort of reset the way the global financial system works. And we have the chance to do that. So that's how I think I would like to see the UK going about things in 2021. And if you want to see a more detailed agenda for doing that, go to Policy Exchange and have a look at our paper called Capital Shift, which is all about green finance and the opportunity ahead of us.
Very nice.
Charlotte, can I just jump
Oh,
in?
yeah.
There's one thing that is worth noting that we haven't there is of course the other big player that we are going to have to work with is the EU, and I think that is going to be a kind of challenge. I mean, my understanding is that actually there are fairly good talks on climate specifically with the EU, but that's perhaps doesn't kind of account for all of the front-facing politics that comes into this.
And they haven't committed to the same target, have they, at the moment? So this is what we need to work on going forward.
Pretty close, though. They have high ambitions, and we can do an awful lot of working together with the EU. And I think this is one area. Of course, there are fundamental differences in the way we approach it. For example, they're setting out a green taxonomy at the moment that we might disagree with, but they do still have high ambitions, and we should seek to cooperate with them.
Yeah, I would add to that, Charlotte, that we're a global business, but we've signed up to the European Green Digital Coalition only a couple of weeks ago, which is bringing the big businesses together to ensure that that's happening pan-European. So they are showing leadership from a business perspective, but I know that the UK is playing a part in that as well.
And Andrew, from your perspective, what does that look like more in terms of the EU?
The EU?
Yeah, like what's the next stages when you talk to them?
Well, look, my role's focused on business. Businesses are, they're just getting on and doing this, to be honest. I mean, every day, their two biggest sources of productivity, which is capital and people, are telling them this is an agenda that they need to engage with. So there's no illusion, no reticence. There are initiatives like the Global Race to Zero, which is a global UN brand that businesses all over the world are signing up to. As it happens today, the UK has more businesses signing up as a percentage in absolute terms than any other territory, but that's great because that's us showing global leadership, and hopefully that will inspire others to action. And if there is anyone who's dialed in from a business, however small, whether you're a large multinational company or the very smallest sole trader or business, you too can sign up to the Race to Zero. So Google that, or Google the SME Climate Hub. The UK government's got an initiative to support small businesses doing exactly that. It's actually really important that everybody feels that they can be part of it. So your nation states are sort of your one vertical actor, but there are also society, community, voluntary groups, and the domain that I operate in, which is business. Kulveer's business is one such example, but actually most businesses are now on exactly this journey. The importance of that is that whichever country you're leading, when you turn up in Glasgow on the 1st of November, if your business community has signed up to the aggressive targets to be net zero by 2050 and to have decarbonised very significantly by 2030, as the leader of that economy, you're going to have the confidence to make the sort of stretching pledges that we've all been talking about being needed today. So business is a really, really fundamental actor to this whole thing.
Cool. I've got one question on the Zoom link, if anyone wants to give their thoughts on this. So Frank Carpenter asks, what is the government doing to make sure that all councils are on board with their climate change strategy and doing everything they can to contribute to the targets, including some of their own Conservative councils who may still be playing catch up or not off the starting block? Would anyone like to come in on this question? Andrew?
Yeah, I'll have a swing because it feels slightly political, not a discordant note. We're all in favour of a vibrant political debate. Look, actually, as somebody who's a massive fan of localism, it almost ought to be the other way round. I mean, government shouldn't be sitting here telling councils what to do. They're wonderful, democratically, often more responsive to their local community entities. And so I hope that every local authority is on board with taking action on climate. And there is a huge amount that they can do as first tier planning bodies, for example. They can be a big part of how do we protect nature and biodiversity. We've talked a lot about carbon, and that's the sort of slightly hard science and easy to measure side of things. But a lot of this is about nature resilience. It's about making our environments more resilient for the climate change that will happen or is already happening. And local authorities are in the front line. The government's overall role there should then be to make sure that as far as possible, we are cascading the resources to those frontline authorities. I happen to have some excellent local examples in the part of the world where I live. They've declared a climate emergency, but they haven't stopped at virtue signalling. They are getting on with sourcing their own energy from renewable, with looking at what they can do from a local plan perspective, how they can help deliver the government's walking and safe cycling to work scheme. A massive thing that I suspect there is enormous unanimity around is that if we don't have to get into our motor cars, whether they're electric, including, with some rare earths from different parts of the world, or petroleum powered, wouldn't it be much better if our children could walk to school in a safe way? The delivery for that is on the ground, delivered by local authorities. And whatever flavour and whatever politics they are, I pay tribute to them because we forget. It's easy to forget. And, as we talk about this on this, excluding myself, this high level illustrious panel, that the actual hard yards of delivering change falls to often local councils and local councillors.
Cool. So we're actually coming, it's gone so quickly, the time, but we're coming to the end of this panel discussion. So I wondered, it's such a huge topic. I wondered if everyone just wanted to summarise maybe in a minute or so their parting thoughts before we leave. So do you want to start, Benedict?
Thank you, Charlotte. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'm really grateful to ConHome and to Atos for making it possible. I think, we've covered a lot of ground. Really, the fundamental point is that we do need to raise ambition and we do need to increase speed. And I think what's become clear from the whole discussion is that takes every single element of society, from international bodies like the UN to national nation states, and as Andrew said, it doesn't stop there. It also goes to companies large and small and down to the local level of government. So I think there's huge opportunities to do that at each level. We do need to ensure that there's innovation at every stage, and so digital technologies like the ones that Atos provide are really key to that, but government needs to unlock the market to ensure that happens. Thank you very much.
Emma?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think the thing that kind of comes out of it for me is that we've got kind of, like, as I say, like, it's a big opportunity with the tech towards making people feel engaged in all of this and making people feel excited, and feeling like net zero is an opportunity for them. And I think it's just about ensuring that everyone feels like they have the tools at their disposal to make the most of it. That seems to me like the key thing we can kind of bring from this.
And Andrew?
Yeah, we can do this. The key thing I want to leave everybody with is the empowering thought that we can absolutely do this. Every technology that we need to achieve the climate reduction target already exists. They're not necessarily deployed, they're not necessarily at scale, but the technology is in a lab somewhere, ready to go and ready to scale. But we can only do it together. We have 220 days between now and the start of COP26. So everybody, if there's one action from today, is go back and look up what are they doing, what is they as conservative activists doing, as conservative councils, because together there's no doubt that we can fix this. That doesn't mean we will. It means we've all got to work together well in the way that we've seen a little bit around the pandemic, around the search and now the deployment for a vaccine. But that sort of level of mobilization and engagement is what it's going to take. And the good news is, I think we can do that.
Cool. And Kulveer?
Well, firstly, thank you to ConHome and to my fellow panelists for their time. Great conversation, and you're right, Andrew, we can do it. We are doing it. As he said, the private sector is doing it for many reasons, because we know our customers, our employees, our stakeholders want us to do it. We have the greenest supercomputers in the world. We built them that way. We're being efficient. But I think the opportunity is further here for us, because as we do build back better, as we do build back greener, we will be building back digital. It's going to be part of the future. So let's make sure we use the greenest technology in the best way possible. And we give the consumers not just what they want, but more of what they want in terms of visibility of the impact that their good intentions have for the sustainability and for the planet.
Well, thank you. I certainly feel very energised myself and empowered after this session. It's been really fascinating. So I'd like to thank you all so much, Andrew, Benedict, Emma and Kulveer. I'd like to thank our partner at Atos, and I'd like to thank everyone that tuned in today. Our next event starts at 2 p.m. when Ryan Henson, CEO for the Coalition for Global Prosperity, will be in conversation with Sajid Javid. So make sure to tune in. You can find all our events on our YouTube channel afterwards. In the meantime, thanks again, everyone, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.